All right, we're back in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 this morning, and we're taking the time to deal with this chapter because it has been somewhat controversial in recent times, so we want to be sure we understand where we are on it. Paul starts the chapter with one of our objectives to understand the divine will regarding marriage. Paul talks about their responsibilities in marriage, first of all, what marriage involves from the standpoint of responsibility. And so we want to understand that, and we want to see the impact of marriage on the spiritual life of the Christian, which he will talk about in the latter part of the chapter, and we didn't get to any of that last week. So he lays the foundation for answering their questions. And their first question is, may we marry? As Christians, is it good to marry? Paul must have said something to them about the responsibilities of marriage while he was with them, and perhaps warned them of dangers to the marriage and to the relationship while he was with them. So we'll take a look again at that. Now, concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. So obviously Paul is talking here about in answer to some questions that they had in the letter that they had sent to him. And so he's going to respond to those first. And the way he's going to respond to their questions is to give the fundamentals of the marriage relationship, including its permanence. He will talk about that as he goes. So he says, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife and let each woman have her own husband. That's going to imply monogamy. It's going to imply the sin of fornication against a marriage and against God. So we'll want to look at that. So he says, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So starting off, why would you get married? Well, one reason would be to avoid fornication, to meet needs, each other's needs for intimacy, and that's what he addresses here. The intimacy of marriage secures the bond between the two. In the beginning, God said, the two shall become one flesh. And it satisfies the needs of each of the parties in the marriage so that they don't have to go elsewhere and commit fornication maybe and do that which is wrong. If the needs are met in the home with the wife, then there's no reason for the husband to go somewhere else. If each is supplying the needs of their mates, if they're not doing that, then somebody else may do it outside the marriage. So you want to take care, and Paul addresses that in the beginning. Do not deprive one another except for consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So we watch all of that in our marriages. He says, I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. In other words, it's good for a man to have his own wife. That's a concession. He says, in the present distress, which we talked about some last week, in the present distress, it's a concession to them to allow them to go on and get married. But it would be better, he says, I wish that all men were even as I myself. How was Paul? He was unmarried, you see. And in the present distress, that's probably the best. But each one has his own gift from God. Each one is tempted in different ways. And if one is tempted sexually, then let him go on and get married, is what Paul is saying. So question 2 is to the unmarried and to the widows. Should widows and widowers remain unmarried? And Paul's advice was to stay unmarried in that present distress. Widows and widowers have the same rights to marry as anyone else that's unmarried would have. If no self-control, let them marry. It's better to marry than to burn. Burn in passion, I think, is what he's suggesting here. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. Better to marry than to burn with passion. Then he says to the married, so he must have had a question there from them. Should married persons remain married? If you're a Christian and your mate goes to something else, what do you do is the idea. Should married persons remain married? Paul's answer is divorce is forbidden. Divorce is not going to be the answer. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband. To depart suggests to divorce in this context, as we see. So a wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. Why not divorce her? Because they're united from God, by God. And marriage precedes all other relationships in terms of time. Marriage goes back to the very beginning in the creation, you see. So we take it that God intended that for all humanity, in spite of the fact that the law of Moses came along and even the gospel came along. Marriage is a relationship that goes back to creation, doesn't necessarily go back to law. There are laws governing it in the law of Moses, and there are laws in the gospel that govern it. But the relationship itself and the permanence of that relationship goes all the way back to the beginning, you see. But if she does leave, he says, remain unmarried or return to the husband and be reconciled. Because marriage to another would involve fornication, you see. Okay? That is God's basic teaching on the permanence of marriage. In Matthew 19, Jesus said, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. So that's true on both sides. There's a marriage unites those two at the top there. If he puts her away without fornication, of course, he'll say that, except for fornication, he puts her away and marries another, then that's adultery. And if someone marries the one put away, except for fornication, that's adultery. You see. So it's true on both sides. We want to remember that. A woman who has a husband who does not believe. So now Paul is going to get to the issue of a marriage to someone who is not a Christian. He's talking to Christians. So the expectation is that the one beginning is a Christian and they're married to a non-Christian. That could be that the Christian obeyed the gospel after the marriage. Probably that would be true in most cases since the gospel was so new in Corinth, you see. And the wife, in this case, would not have obeyed the gospel. So, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. A woman who has a husband, the woman is a Christian, and the man, if he's willing to live with her as a Christian. That may be in Paul's thinking that she has some special spiritual responsibilities. Her morals would change if she obeyed the gospel. Would he still be willing to live with her? Her recreation would probably change. You see, her beliefs would change. Might even change toward him and their relationship some. Her responsibilities to the church would be there, which might include even some sacrifice of money or some other physical thing that she would have to give to the needs of others that came in need in the church, maybe. So see, being a member of the church and being a Christian, just your moral values are going to change from the pagan values or the pagan lifestyle of those around you. So he says, if a woman has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. I think what he is getting at in verse 14 is that their marriage is approved by God. Even though he's not a Christian, their marriage is still valid, you see. She's set apart to him. Doesn't mean he's a Christian. It just means their marriage is valid. It is set apart or sanctified. Otherwise, their children would be unclean. They would be coming from a relationship that was improper, you see, if that were the case. We talked about this, I think, a little bit last week. Now, are non-Christians subject to God's law on marriage? That's a question that's been raised in preacher circles, at least, and in some churches. Some facts to consider. Marriage applies to all people. Marriage is honorable and the bed is undefiled. Hebrews 13, verse 4. So, marriage applies to all. It goes back to creation, to the very beginning. God created woman and brought them together so that the two become one. That's true of marriage for all people. That's true of people in foreign countries that have never heard of the gospel even. You see. Some were guilty of fornication prior to becoming Christians. 1 Corinthians 6, he says, some of you were these things. And he says, these that practice these things, fornication, adultery, they violate God's will. And such were some of you. See, they were, before they were Christians, they were under these laws, under these responsibilities. They had to put such things away as the evil that he talks about. Repentance requires a change, Matthew 3, verse 8. So that is always true. And if a person is in a sinful relationship in their marriage, then they would have to change, you see. And Jesus appealed to the creation in Matthew 19, if you want a passage on that. You can read Matthew chapter 19. Okay? So that raises the question whether new Christians with previous divorce or remarriage situations may remain with their subsequent mates. When baptized and all sins of the past are washed away, may the new Christian remain in a marriage not previously acceptable. Now remember, we saw this earlier. On each side of these relationships, it's adultery. So the question is, does baptism change that? Does it change that that's adultery? No, it really doesn't. And I will show you this. Suppose this man divorces his wife and goes into a homosexual marriage. Can he remain in that relationship? Why not? Because baptism didn't change that relationship. You see that? So I don't think we need to argue that at length, especially unless you have some question about it you want to ask. Okay? This chart just shows that baptism didn't change an adulterous relationship. You see. Okay, if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? This raises another question, I guess, about can the Christian whose mate leaves them marry someone else? And that question is answered, I think, in the word bondage. there are two words used in 1 Corinthians 7, one toward the end of the chapter, that refers to the marriage bond. And perhaps this is unfortunate, the use of this word bondage here. It's a different word from the bond that God holds you to here. This word bondage, let me see if I've got it here. There we go. This word bondage means held by constraint of law or the sanctity, became a slave to someone. It refers to the responsibility. Notice, he began in the first part of the chapter talking about the responsibilities of marriage and how serious those responsibilities are. And he gets to verse 15. Here's a person who is a Christian who has those responsibilities and is married before God, but the mate leaves. In such case, the Christian is not subject to sacrifice or spiritual convictions about it. You have to just let him leave if he leaves. You don't have to meet the marriage responsibilities. You're not under bondage to meet the marriage responsibilities any longer, you see. And you're not under responsibility to maintain togetherness. You would have a hard time doing that anyway if he's gone, if he leaves you. You couldn't do that. And God's not going to hold you accountable if he leaves to fulfill the responsibilities of marriage. You're not under bondage to fulfill the marriage responsibilities that Paul has said is fundamental to the very nature of the relationship. And see how he started the chapter by telling us what the responsibilities of marriage are, you see. So I believe that's what he's talking about in this passage. Do I need to go back for anything? What should the believer do if the unbeliever departs on his own? Well, the Christian should let him go because we are peaceful. You're not to try to force him into a situation if he leaves. Okay? Any question there? Anyone? We're hitting some high points, and these questions usually get long debates and sometimes heated debates, but this is what I believe the passage is talking about. Okay? Yeah. 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 Right. Right. The whole family relationship, and I'm glad you're pointing this out, the whole family relationship should be based on God's will, and the Christian should see that and always work toward keeping that spiritual part of the relationship intact. You see what I'm saying? And that's very important. What Matt says is right about all of that. Okay. Now then, But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. He's been talking about marriage and the relationship and the idea that the Corinthians are asking, the questions they're asking all center around, if I obey the gospel, do I have to get divorced? If I obey the gospel, do I stay married? If I obey the gospel, can I marry? You see, under the present distress, can I marry even? So there are all kinds of questions coming up here from them now that they're dealing with the marriage relationship. So he says, was any of you called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Well, you can't do that. But what he's saying probably here is, if anyone becomes a Christian that was a Jew, circumcised as a Jew, then let him not become uncircumcised. In other words, socially he's a Jew, nationally, physically he's Jewish as a person. He's not under obligation to become a Greek necessarily, you see. And he says circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commands of God is what matters. So whether they were a Jew or a Gentile wouldn't matter. And they weren't to try to become a Gentile if they were Jewish, or become a Jew if they were. The point is, these social relationships are different. Let each one remain in the same calling of which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can be made free, rather use it. You see, if you obey the gospel and you're a slave and obligated to your master, live in that relationship and be a Christian, but stay a slave. And if you're freed from being a slave, then use that opportunity to live your life as a Christian. Don't forsake your Christianity for your freedom, and take care to perhaps convert others and lead others to Christ. Use your freedom for the Lord, is what he's saying, I think. You see. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freed man. In other words, we're freed in Christ spiritually, even though they might have remained a slave socially, physically, or whatever. You see that, what he's saying? Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. Romans 6 talks about being a slave to Christ, slave to righteousness rather than to evil. You were bought at a price. You're Christ's slave because you were bought at a price. What is that? What's the price? The blood of Christ, isn't it? We're bought with the blood of Christ. So you are bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. If you're freed, don't become slaves of men. And that may imply in this passage, in this context, going back to sin. Don't go back to sin as a slave to men. Remember, you're a slave to Christ. So you're going to live righteously. you see. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. If you're called a slave, be a Christian slave. You got it? If you're called free, be a Christian, freed. Control your own life in relationship to your relationship to Christ, you see. Okay? Question, does one become a Christian necessitate changing cultural situations which are right? No, you just do right in those relationships. As God has called each, in this manner let him walk. Jew versus Gentile, slave versus free. That's what we've seen. Right? Okay. Now some have taken this passage here to mean, let's go back, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. Some have taken that to mean if you're married and that's an adulterous relationship, you can stay with it. Is that what he's saying? No, adultery is wrong. If it's adultery, it's wrong. If one is a professional thief, is Paul saying, brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called? So he remains a thief? Why not? Because that's sinful. That's not a good relationship. It's not a good calling. It's sinful to be that, you see? So if you're living in adultery, he's not saying you're free to stay in the adulterous relationship any more than he's telling a thief he can stay a thief. Yeah.
That would have been like Paul, having the revelation that he had, being baptized, and then went right back out and hunted Christians.
Right. Right. Wouldn't work, would it? Right. Okay. So I think we got this one. Now, concerning virgins, and I'm running here. I know we don't have a lot of time to talk through each one of these points that Paul makes here, but our clock runs too fast. So, concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord. Notice the word commandment. I think he's saying the Lord is not commanding. I don't have a commandment from the Lord on this. He does have teaching from the Lord, and he's going to say, I believe I'm in sync with the Holy Spirit on this, but I'm not commanding. You got to watch the wording here, I think. I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. He's trustworthy because he's receiving inspired teaching and inspired thinking on these things. So he says, I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. If you are bound to a wife, do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. He's saying it's best not to marry. Would it be better for persons never married to remain unmarried? Paul's advice, remain as you are. in the present distress. Now, we need to probably look at a couple of things here. In this context, loosed from a wife is contrasted to bound. Remember, we said bound suggests the idea of meeting the responsibilities of marriage. So it may mean that one is free by the death of the mate. If you're freed from a wife, maybe she died. Or maybe she went and committed adultery and you put her away for adultery. That would be acceptable, wouldn't it? Or you've never married. There are several reasons why you might be freed from a wife. You might not be bound to a wife. You see that? Are you with me? Everybody with me? Now, what is the present distress? Likely he's talking about persecutions and how people, both the public view of Christians coming out of Rome or local problems with persecution, people abusing Christians because they're Christians in Corinth there or other places. Or it may be the present distress or things like famine or economic issues that the Christian might have taking care of a wife and family, you see. Might even be a slave. He's talked about slaves. So there are a lot of reasons. I'm not sure exactly what specifically the present distress, but I know that what Paul is saying is it'll be hard for you to be a Christian. You'll be tempted maybe, or you won't be able to take care of your wife and meet the responsibilities. So the present circumstances, whatever they were, made it hard for a person if they were going to take a wife and have a family. There are more responsibilities if you're individual by yourself, and maybe even some as a Christian. If your wife is not a Christian, or your husband is not a Christian and you're a Christian, then it's difficult to take care of your circumstances. It's easier to be unmarried and uncluttered with other responsibilities. You see what he's saying? Even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she is not sinned. So Paul is saying, I'm not saying don't get married as a law, as a rule. I'm just saying under the present circumstances, it'd be better not to be married and have those responsibilities. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh. See, it'll be harder for you if you're married and have a family. Just think about it this way. Here's a man. He's 30 years old. He's got a wife. He's got 2 or 3 little children. And some come against them and do to them what's happening in some countries, like in African countries today, where they're killing people. So they come into your village. Now, which is better for you? If you have to watch your children and your wife be killed in front of your eyes, or you have to suffer the persecution by yourself? Which would be worse? You tell me. The one with a wife and children would be terrible, wouldn't it, to have to watch that? Can you imagine, Jay? Can't imagine it, can you? You'd rather just handle that by yourself, wouldn't you? Be better just to be killed by yourself. See, you'll have trouble in the flesh if you're married. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. In other words, the time is short where it'd be better if you weren't married, if you didn't have one, if you didn't have a wife. So take that into consideration when you're getting married. Those who weep as though they did not weep, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess. See, it's going to be costly. It's all kinds of issues that come up. And those who use this world as not misusing it, for the form of this world is passing away. But I want you to be without care, spiritually. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord. He's only got himself and the Lord and his relationship with the Lord to take care of. He who is married cares about the things of the world, how he can please his wife. So which is better, to be married or to be unmarried, given those circumstances? You see why Paul would say what he's saying to them? It was a rough world at that time. These people weren't living in America. They were living in Rome. There's a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, but she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she can please her husband. See, she's got an extra burden. Suppose you're a Christian woman and your husband is a worldly pagan. Which is going to be easier for you, to be married or unmarried? You see what Paul is saying? Y'all can think of these things in your own mind as you go here. This I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you. In other words, I'm not telling you not to get married. I'm not putting a leash on you. I'm just saying what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. I want you to be free to be a true Christian and not to be tied up with things that could get you away from the Lord. You see, that's what he's saying. To avoid becoming too attached to this world, to be free from concern and divided devotion. Divided devotion would be to your wife or husband or to the Lord. But if any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, now this is probably referring to the father of a girl, and she's wanting to get married, and he needs to give his consent or not give his consent, you see. If any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. In other words, the father may do well to try to keep the girl from getting married at that time. So then, he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. In other words, it's okay to let them marry, but it'd be better if they didn't than if you can keep that from happening. Why? The present distress. And maybe some personal things involved in the family. Some think this is talking about the one who's going to marry the girl. My view is it's got in mind at least the father. There are several things we've talked about this morning that are subject to some discussion, as you all probably know. Okay, verse 39, a wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. If her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. I don't know of another passage where Paul uses the phrase in the Lord that he's not talking about being a Christian. You can take that as you will. It seems to me Paul is saying, if you're a widow and you get married, be sure you marry a Christian in light of the whole context of the passage. You can study that. I think, did you ring our second bell? Has the second bell rung yet? You're headed there. Okay, I think that's it. She is happier if she remains as she is according to my judgment. That is, in those present distresses. And I think I also have the Spirit of God. Okay? Quick overview of that chapter. Sorry we don't have 2 hours instead of 1.